The house on Blackthorn Road was never spoken of in polite conversation. It sat at the edge of town, cloaked in shadows cast by gnarled trees, and was the subject of whispered warnings. No one dared approach it after nightfall, not even the bravest of thrill-seekers. They all knew the stories, tales of people who entered and were never the same, or worse, never returned. Evelyn had heard those stories all her life. She grew up in the shadow of that house, the stories dripping into her childhood like poison. But unlike the others, Evelyn was drawn to it. Perhaps it was her nature, or maybe it was the peculiar pull she felt every time she walked past. It was as if the house was alive, watching, waiting. And tonight, she decided she would answer its call. The air was colder than it should have been for an early autumn night. The moon hung low, veiled by a thin layer of clouds, casting the house in an eerie, pale light. Evelyn approached, her flashlight trembling in her grip, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The front door was slightly ajar, as though it had been left open just for her. She hesitated, her heart thundering in her chest. Stepping inside, the air changed. Thick, heavy, and stale, as if untouched by time. The floorboards groaned underfoot, each step an unwelcome intrusion. The house smelled of mildew and decay, but beneath it was something else, a metallic tang that she couldn't quite place. Her flashlight revealed walls adorned with faded wallpaper and scratches, deep gouges that crisscrossed in chaotic patterns. The living room was a mess of overturned furniture and broken glass. But it wasn't just the state of disrepair that unsettled her. It was the silence. A silence so profound it seemed to press against her ears, muffling even the sound of her own breathing. In the corner of the room stood an antique mirror, its surface warped and grimy. As she approached, her reflection appeared distorted, her features elongated, her eyes too large, her mouth twisted into a grin she wasn't making. She recoiled, but the grin remained in the mirror, widening. Then it spoke, a voice not hers, but using her own lips. "You shouldn't have come." Evelyn stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as the temperature in the room plummeted. The mirror cracked with a sound that seemed to echo endlessly, the fissures spreading like veins. From those cracks seeped a black, viscous substance, dripping onto the floor and pooling at her feet. It smelled of rot, and as it spread, it moved with purpose, inching toward her shoes. She bolted, running deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing as the sound of whispers followed her. They grew louder, more insistent, voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage and despair, words she couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. Leave. Yet the house seemed to warp around her, the hallway stretching endlessly no matter how fast she ran. Doors lined the corridor, each slightly ajar. From one, a pale hand slipped out, skeletal fingers curling as if beckoning her. Another emitted a guttural growl, low and wet, like something scraping its way toward her. She chose the last door on the left, slamming it shut behind her. The room was a bedroom, untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the house. It was eerily pristine, as though someone had just stepped out moments before. A single candle burned on the dresser, casting flickering shadows. On the bed lay a diary, its leather cover embossed with the initials CL. Unable to resist, she opened it. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls, words pressed so hard into the paper they tore through in places. Each entry told a tale of torment, of something within the house that consumed its inhabitants. The last entry was unfinished, the ink smudged as if the writer had been dragged away mid-sentence. "I can hear it now, coming for me. It knows I'm here. The sound of breathing filled the room, slow and deliberate. She turned, her flashlight catching the glint of eyes in the corner. Not one pair, but dozens, staring unblinking from the shadows. A low, guttural laugh reverberated, and the shadows began to move, coalescing into a figure that defied explanation. Its form shifted and twisted, its edges blurred as though it were a living smear on reality. Evelyn screamed, dropping the diary and running for the door. But the house had other plans. The walls seemed to close in, the floor tilting beneath her feet. The whispers returned, now shouting, accusing her of trespassing, of disturbing what should remain undisturbed. She reached the front door, her fingers grasping the handle, but as she pulled, it wouldn't budge. The black substance from the mirror oozed down the walls, pooling at her feet once more. It crept up her legs, cold and suffocating. She struggled, screamed, but the house swallowed the sound. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in the cracked mirror, grinning back at her. The house on Blackthorn Road stood silent once more, its door slightly ajar, waiting for the next visitor who couldn't resist its call.
Story number 2.
In the small town of Hollow Pines, there was a stretch of woods locals called the Dead Path. Parents warned their children to never enter, hunters avoided it, and even animals steered clear. The stories said the trees whispered at night, carrying the voices of those who had vanished there. Mia didn't believe in those stories. A freelance photographer with a penchant for the macabre, she decided the Dead Path would be the perfect subject for her latest project. Her friends begged her not to go, but curiosity and a desire for something authentic outweighed their warnings. The entrance to the woods was marked by a crumbling stone archway. Moss clung to it, and the air grew colder as she stepped beneath. The moment she crossed into the forest, the world seemed to shift. The sounds of the town behind her vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence so complete it felt as though the woods were holding their breath. Mia adjusted her camera, snapping a few shots of the trees, their twisted branches resembling skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The deeper she went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The trees stood unnaturally close together, their trunks warped as if they'd grown in agony. The ground was littered with rotting leaves that squelched underfoot, releasing a foul odor that turned her stomach. She stopped when she saw it, a clearing in the center of the woods, bathed in an otherworldly gray light. In the middle stood a solitary tree, its bark blackened and scarred as if it had been struck by lightning repeatedly. Dangling from its branches were objects that made her blood run cold, small, crudely fashioned dolls made of twigs and cloth. They swayed gently despite the still air. Mia raised her camera, capturing the scene. As the shutter clicked, she heard something. A faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike. She froze, her breath hitching. The sound came again, this time behind her. Slowly, she turned, but there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. It echoed back at her, distorted and wrong, as though the forest were mocking her. Then she saw the footprints. Small and bare, they trailed through the mud, circling her. But they didn't lead away. They simply stopped a few feet ahead, vanishing into nothingness. A cold dread washed over her. She wasn't alone. The giggle came again, closer this time, followed by a low, raspy whisper. "Stay." She spun around, and that's when she saw them. Children, at least they resembled children. Their skin was pallid, their eyes hollow black voids, and their mouths stretched too wide in grotesque smiles. They stood just at the edge of the clearing, watching her, their heads tilting in unison like curious animals. Mia stumbled backward, nearly dropping her camera. The blackened tree groaned, its branches creaking as the dolls began to twist and jerk, as if alive. One of the children stepped forward, its skeletal hand outstretched. It pointed at her camera. "Take a picture," it whispered, its voice layered with countless others. "Stay with us." Panic overtook her. She turned and ran, plunging back into the forest. The giggles followed her, echoing from every direction. The trees seemed to shift as she ran, their branches clawing at her clothes, her hair. The path she'd taken into the woods was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of endless darkness. She tripped, her camera skidding across the ground. Crawling to retrieve it, she froze when she saw the screen. The last photo she had taken was no longer of the blackened tree. Instead, it showed her, standing in the clearing, surrounded by the children. But it wasn't her as she was now. In the image, her eyes were hollow, her face pale, her expression a twisted smile. A guttural growl rumbled behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with something not of this world. It was tall and gaunt, its body a writhing mass of shadow and bone. Its face was featureless, save for a gaping maw that dripped with black ichor. It loomed over her, its elongated fingers reaching out. Before she could scream, it plunged its hand into her chest. Pain unlike anything she'd ever felt consumed her as the world went black. When Mia didn't return, her friends called the authorities. A search party combed the woods for weeks, but all they found was her camera, lying near the blackened tree. The photos on it told a story no one dared to speak of. Each frame showed Mia in the clearing, her transformation documented in haunting detail. In the final image, she stood beside the children, her smile wide and unnatural, her hollow eyes staring straight at the lens. The dead path claimed another, and the whispers in the trees grew louder.
Story number 3.
The last bus to Ashfield only ran at midnight. It was a route no one wanted to take unless they had no other choice. The bus driver, an old man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes, never spoke. He just opened the doors, nodded to the passengers, and drove. Lena had heard the rumors, stories about people who took the midnight bus and never returned. But she had no car, no money for a cab, and no one to call for a ride. Her shift at the diner ran late, and the bus was already pulling up, its headlights cutting through the fog. As she stepped on, she noticed how empty it was. Just her and one other passenger, a man sitting at the very back, his face hidden by the shadow of his hoodie. The doors hissed shut behind her, and the bus lurched forward. Lena chose a seat near the middle, close enough to the driver for comfort, but far enough from the man in the back. The bus groaned as it rolled through the deserted streets, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead. She tried to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. Minutes passed, and she realized something odd. The route wasn't right. The bus wasn't heading toward Ashfield. Instead, it veered onto a narrow, unlit road she didn't recognize. She leaned forward, hesitating before speaking. "Excuse me," she called to the driver, her voice trembling slightly. "I think you missed the turn." The driver didn't respond. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Lena frowned, glancing out the window. The landscape had changed. The buildings and streetlights were gone, replaced by dense woods shrouded in mist. "Hey," she tried again, louder this time. "You're going the wrong way." Still, no answer. The man in the back shifted in his seat, the sound of fabric brushing against plastic echoing too loudly in the empty bus. Her pulse quickened as she stood and approached the driver. "Sir, where are we going?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. The driver turned to her slowly, and Lena's breath caught. His face was wrong. His eyes were milky white, his skin pallid and stretched too tightly over his skull. When he smiled, his teeth were jagged, yellowed points. "Sit down," he rasped, his voice like nails scraping metal. "You're already on the path." Lena stumbled back, her heart pounding. She turned to the other passenger, desperate for help, but the man at the back was no longer sitting. He stood now, towering, his hood slipping back to reveal a face she couldn't comprehend, shifting features, eyes that blinked sideways, and a mouth that opened too wide, filled with writhing black tendrils. She screamed, backing away, but the bus itself seemed to come alive. The seats buckled, the walls pulsated as if breathing, and the floor beneath her feet grew soft and warm, oozing with a dark, viscous fluid. The windows no longer showed the woods. Instead, they revealed a swirling void of red and black, shapes moving just beyond the glass, shapes that watched her, their countless eyes glowing like embers. The man-thing at the back moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, the tendrils spilling from its mouth, reaching toward her. Lena turned and banged on the door, pleading for it to open, but it wouldn't budge. The bus was speeding now, its engine roaring like a beast. "Let me off!" she screamed. "Please!" The driver turned to her again, his milky eyes narrowing. "No one gets off," he said. "Not until we reach the end." She looked back at the creature, now mere feet away. Desperation took over, and she grabbed her bag, hurling it at the thing. It didn't flinch, didn't even react. Its tendrils snaked closer, brushing against her skin, cold and wet like rotting flesh. The last thing Lena saw was its gaping mouth descending, swallowing her screams. The bus rolled back into town just before dawn, pulling up to the usual stop. The doors opened with a hiss, and a young woman stepped off, her face pale, her eyes vacant. She clutched a camera bag in her hand, but there was no camera inside. She walked away without a word, disappearing into the morning mist. The driver shut the doors and adjusted his cap, a faint smile playing on his lips. The bus pulled away, heading toward its next stop. It always found new passengers, and it was always hungry.
Story number 4.
There was a motel on the edge of town that everyone knew, but no one stayed at. The Hollow View, its faded sign claimed, though locals joked it was hollow in more ways than one. Travelers who stopped there often left in a rush, if they left at all. Clara was desperate. Her car had broken down, and the nearest mechanic wouldn't be open until morning. The Hollow View was the only place within walking distance. The motel loomed ahead, a squat, decaying structure bathed in the sickly glow of a single flickering neon light. She hesitated before stepping inside. The lobby smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The man behind the counter looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His name tag read, Ralph. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice rasping like sandpaper. Clara nodded, handing over her credit card. As he processed her payment, she glanced around. The wallpaper was peeling, and the lone plant in the corner was withered, its leaves curling inward as if trying to escape. "Room 6, Ralph said, sliding the key across the counter. His fingers lingered on the metal for a moment too long, and Clara noticed his nails were chipped and yellowed. "Don't wander." She didn't respond, taking the key and heading down the dimly lit corridor. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, the carpet squelching under her boots. She reached room 6 and hesitated before unlocking the door. The room was modest, a bed, a nightstand, and an old TV mounted on the wall. The air inside was stale, and the wallpaper was the same peeling pattern as the lobby. But what struck her most was the mirror above the dresser. It was cracked, the fissures running like veins across its surface. As she moved, the reflection didn't quite match her actions, lagging by a fraction of a second. She shivered and closed the bathroom door behind her as she prepared for bed. The pipes groaned as she turned on the tap, the water running rusty for several seconds. Washing her face, she felt a strange prickling at the back of her neck, as though she were being watched. When she looked up, the bathroom mirror wasn't reflecting her at all. Instead, it showed the room behind her, empty, save for a figure standing in the far corner. Clara spun around, but the corner was empty. Her breathing quickened as she backed out of the bathroom, her eyes darting to the cracked mirror above the dresser. It showed the room as it was now, just her and the bed. Still, the sense of being watched lingered, thick and suffocating. She crawled into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. The old TV flickered to life on its own, static filling the screen. She grabbed the remote and tried turning it off, but the power button didn't work. The static shifted, images emerging, blurred at first, then sharpening. It was the lobby, shown from a low angle. Ralph stood behind the counter, his smile grotesquely wide now, his teeth impossibly sharp. He looked directly at the camera. Or was he looking at her? She threw the remote aside and turned away from the TV, her heart pounding. She told herself it was a malfunction, a quirk of old technology. But as the night wore on, the noises began. It started as faint scratching coming from the walls. Then soft footsteps like someone pacing outside her door. She peeked out through the peephole but saw only the empty hallway. The sound didn't stop, though. If anything, it grew louder, closer. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Grateful for the distraction, she grabbed it, but the screen showed only a blank text message. Then another, and another. Words began to appear, one letter at a time. "Don't look behind you." Her blood ran cold. She dropped the phone, refusing to turn around. But the air behind her grew heavy, colder, as though something, or someone, was there. Then came the voice, a low whisper, raspy and unnatural. "You should have stayed on the road." She couldn't help it. She turned. The mirror above the dresser showed her room again, but this time it was filled with shadows, writhing and shifting. In the center stood a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a veil of black smoke. It raised a hand, pointing directly at her. The door to her room slammed open, and the hallway beyond was no longer the motel. It was endless, stretching into darkness, its walls pulsating like the inside of a living creature. Clara's screams echoed as she was pulled forward, her feet no longer her own, dragging her into the abyss. The next morning, Ralph was at the counter when the new guests arrived. A couple traveling through town, looking for a cheap place to stay. He handed them the key to room 6 with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy your stay," he rasped.
Story number 5.
Late one autumn evening, Nathan drove through the endless backroads of the countryside, his car's headlights slicing through a thick fog that seemed to cling to everything. The GPS on his phone had failed hours ago, and the last sign of civilization had been a gas station miles back. As his anxiety grew, his car began to sputter, the engine coughing before it stalled completely. The night swallowed him in silence. He cursed under his breath, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. There was no cell signal, no way to call for help. He stepped out into the damp, suffocating fog, hoping to find a nearby house or some kind of assistance. As he walked, he noticed the road ahead split into two. Between the forks stood an old wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling. On one side, an arrow pointed to Stone Marrow Hollow, and on the other, to Wraithwood Manor. Neither name sounded welcoming, but he couldn't afford to be picky. The flicker of a dim light caught his eye. It was coming from the direction of Wraithwood Manor. Reluctantly, he followed the path, his footsteps crunching on the gravel road. The fog seemed to grow heavier the closer he got to the source of the light, and the air took on a metallic tang that made his skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, the manor came into view. It was a massive, crumbling structure, its Gothic spires piercing the night sky. The light he'd seen flickered from one of the upper windows, but the rest of the house was dark and foreboding. Against his better judgment, Nathan approached the heavy oak door and knocked. The door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. It was met with silence. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying a faint hint of decay. The entryway was lined with faded portraits of people whose faces were oddly blurred, as though they'd been smudged by an unseen hand. A grand staircase curved upward into the darkness, and the light from the upstairs window still flickered faintly. Nathan stepped inside, calling out again, "Is anyone here? My car broke down. I need help." The door slammed shut behind him. His heart jumped as he spun around, but the hallway was empty. The portraits seemed to watch him now, their blurred features twisting subtly when he looked away. The flickering light above drew him forward, an inexplicable pull urging him up the staircase. The wood groaned beneath his weight as he ascended, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. He reached the landing, and the flickering light led him to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he stepped inside. The room was a library, its shelves lined with ancient, dusty tomes. In the center was a single candle burning atop a desk. Beside it lay an open book, its pages filled with incomprehensible symbols and strange diagrams. As he approached, the candle suddenly extinguished, plunging him into darkness. His flashlight flickered, barely holding its beam, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Then a voice spoke, low and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You shouldn't be here." Nathan froze, the flashlight shaking in his hand. I didn't mean to trespass. My car broke down." The voice laughed, a deep, unnatural sound that made his skin crawl. "They all say that." The room began to shift. The bookshelves twisted, their wood splintering and groaning as the tomes spilled onto the floor. The walls seemed to close in, pulsating like the inside of a living thing. Shadows slithered across the room, their forms writhing and shifting. Nathan backed away, his flashlight flickering out completely. In the pitch black, he heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. They grew louder, closer, until he felt a cold breath against his neck. He turned, but there was nothing there. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, its face a blank canvas save for two sunken, glowing orbs where its eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a guttural hiss. Nathan bolted, his body fueled by pure adrenaline. He barreled down the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. The house seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in, the doors disappearing. He stumbled through the entryway, finally finding the front door, and threw it open. The fog outside was gone. Instead, he found himself staring into an endless black void. No stars, no moon, just an oppressive nothingness. The figure was behind him now, its breath rasping in his ear. "You belong to Wraithwood now." The void reached for him, cold tendrils wrapping around his body. His screams echoed into the abyss as the door slammed shut once more. Days later, travelers passing through the area noticed a car abandoned on the road near a fork. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay a single photograph of Wraithwood Manor, its front door slightly open. From the shadows within, two glowing orbs stared out.
Story number 6.
In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, nestled deep in an unmarked valley, there was a cabin known only through whispers, the Lantern House. Travelers who sought shelter there never returned, and locals refused to speak of it, claiming the house wasn't a place, it was a trap. Ethan had heard the stories growing up, but dismissed them as folklore. As an amateur urban explorer with a small YouTube following, he thrived on seeking out such places. So, when a faded map marked with Lantern House arrived in an unaddressed envelope at his apartment, he saw it as a challenge. He set out alone, documenting his journey for his channel. The path to the cabin was overgrown and treacherous, the forest canopy above so dense it turned the afternoon sky into twilight. By the time he reached the clearing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and there it was, the Lantern House. The cabin seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Lanterns hung from its porch and eaves, their light soft but unnatural, casting no shadows. The structure itself looked ancient, its wood weathered and warped. The windows were dark, and the air around the cabin was heavy, stifling. "This is incredible," Ethan whispered into his camera. He narrated as he approached, noting the eerie stillness of the forest and the odd absence of any animal sounds. The door creaked open before he could touch it, revealing a dimly lit interior. He hesitated but stepped inside. The air was colder within, and the lanterns hanging on the walls cast a golden glow that felt alive, flickering erratically. The room was sparse, a single table with a chair, a stone fireplace filled with cold ashes, and a staircase spiraling upward. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols Ethan didn't recognize, their jagged shapes seeming to move in the lantern light. "This place is... wow," he muttered, panning the camera around. He noticed something strange. The carvings on the wall visible through the camera's screen. They appeared as smooth, blank wood. His unease grew as he explored. In one corner, he found a pile of belongings, tattered backpacks, rusted tools, and moldy clothes. Each item seemed untouched by time, as if abandoned yesterday. A chill ran down his spine when he spotted a familiar logo on one of the backpacks. A YouTuber he followed had disappeared a year ago while exploring the area. Ethan's focus snapped back when a soft, melodic hum filled the air. It was faint at first, coming from upstairs. Against his better judgment, he followed it, climbing the creaking stairs with his camera held tight. The second floor was a single, open room. The lanterns here burned brighter, illuminating a figure standing in the center. It was a woman, her back to him, her long dark hair cascading over a tattered white dress. She was the source of the humming, swaying gently as she sang. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice trembling. The humming stopped. The woman turned slowly, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her face was wrong. Where her eyes should have been, there were hollow sockets filled with writhing black worms. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, her teeth jagged and stained red. She tilted her head, a grotesque smile forming as she raised her hand to point at him. The lanterns flared, their light blinding. Ethan stumbled back, dropping his camera. When he looked again, the room was empty. But the lanterns began to flicker wildly, their light dimming, and the melodic hum returned, louder and more distorted. Panicking, Ethan grabbed his camera and bolted down the stairs. The carvings on the walls now pulsed with a sickly glow, and the air was filled with whispers, voices overlapping in a language he couldn't understand. He reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lanterns swung violently, their glass shattering, yet the light remained, hovering like fireflies. One by one, the lights moved toward him, surrounding him. Their glow grew brighter, burning his skin. The whispers grew deafening, and a voice, clear and guttural, spoke directly into his ear. "You came for the story. Now you are part of it." The last thing Ethan saw was the woman's face emerging from the light, her smile impossibly wide, her empty sockets consuming everything. Months later, another urban explorer stumbled upon Ethan's camera lying in the forest near the clearing. The footage showed Ethan's journey up to his arrival at the cabin. The screen cut to static the moment he stepped inside. The lantern house stood dark and silent, its porch now adorned with an additional lantern glowing faintly in the mist.
Story number 7.
The last train of the night pulled into the station at 2:33 a.m., its brakes screeching unnaturally loud against the silence. Emily was the only one on the platform, clutching her coat tighter against the sudden chill in the air. She was exhausted from her late shift at the hospital and desperate to get home. When the doors opened, she hesitated. The train was oddly empty for this time of night. The interior lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the worn seats. Still, she stepped inside, the doors hissing shut behind her. She chose a seat near the middle of the car, setting her bag on her lap. As the train lurched forward, she noticed how silent it was. No hum of the engine, no faint chatter from unseen passengers, just an oppressive quiet. Emily pulled out her phone, hoping to distract herself, but the screen refused to light up. She frowned, pressing the power button repeatedly. Dead. She looked out the window, but the city lights were gone. Instead, there was only darkness, thick and impenetrable, like the train was moving through a void. Her unease grew when the train began to slow. There was no announcement, no familiar automated voice calling out the next station. The train stopped completely, and the lights flickered out for several seconds before sputtering back to life. When they did, Emily wasn't alone. A man now sat at the far end of the car, dressed in a dark suit. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular, but his eyes were what caught her attention. They were entirely black, like two endless pits. "Late night, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and hollow, carrying effortlessly across the space between them. Emily's throat tightened, and she forced a nod, unable to find her voice. The man tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "This train doesn't run on ordinary tracks?" he continued, his thin lips curling into a smile that revealed too many teeth. "You must have been quite tired to miss the signs." "What? What signs?" she managed to whisper. He chuckled, the sound dry and brittle. "The kind you only notice when it's too late." The train jolted forward again, faster this time. Emily clung to her seat as the car swayed violently. She glanced out the window, hoping to see some sign of the city, but what she saw instead froze her blood. Shapes moved in the darkness outside, hulking, writhing figures with too many limbs. Their glowing eyes followed the train, their clawed hands scraping against the windows as if testing their strength. The sound was unbearable, like nails on glass amplified 100-fold. Emily turned back to the man, her panic rising. "What is this? Where are we going?" He leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. "You're heading home," he said, "but not the one you're thinking of." The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the corners of the car seemed to grow, coalescing into vague, humanoid forms. They moved closer with each flicker, their features indistinct, but their intent unmistakable. Emily stood, her instincts screaming at her to run, though there was nowhere to go. She moved toward the door connecting the cars, but it wouldn't budge. The man remained seated, watching her struggle with mild amusement. "You can't leave," he said. "This train only has one destination." "Why me?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to go home." "Everyone wants to go home," he replied, his voice almost sympathetic. "But sometimes home isn't where you left it." The train began to slow again, the screech of its brakes reverberating through the car. The man stood, straightening his suit, and gestured toward the door. "It's your stop." The doors opened, revealing a landscape that made her stomach churn. It was a twisted version of her neighborhood, the houses warped and decayed, their windows glowing with an unnatural red light. The sky was a swirling vortex of black and crimson, and the ground writhed as if alive. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." "Oh, it's very real," the man said, stepping aside, "and it's waiting for you." The shadows surged forward, their clawed hands grabbing her, dragging her toward the open doors. She screamed, fighting with all her strength, but their grip was unrelenting. The last thing she saw before the doors slammed shut was the man's grin, impossibly wide, as he tipped his hat to her. The train sped off into the darkness, its empty seats waiting for the next passenger who missed the signs.
Story number 8.
The fog was unnaturally thick that evening, swirling like smoke across the winding country road. Jack had been driving for hours, his GPS hopelessly frozen and his phone dead. He wasn't entirely sure where he was, but the dim glow of his car's headlights finally illuminated a sign. Cold Brook Cemetery. He hesitated. The road ahead disappeared into the fog, and the nearest town had to be miles away. The cemetery gates, though old and rusted, were slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Beyond them, he could make out the faint outline of a chapel. "Better than sleeping in the car," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight and stepping into the damp night air. The cemetery was eerily silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Rows of gravestones, cracked and weathered, jutted from the earth like jagged teeth. Jack moved quickly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path as he made his way to the chapel. The building was small and decrepit, its steeple leaning dangerously to one side. Its wooden door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The pews were covered in dust, and the altar was bare except for a single unlit candle. Jack sat in the back, deciding to rest for a while before continuing his journey. He set his flashlight on the pew beside him and leaned back, closing his eyes. The quiet didn't last long. A faint tapping echoed through the chapel, soft and irregular. Jack's eyes snapped open, and he grabbed the flashlight, sweeping its beam across the room. There was nothing, only the shadows cast by the warped wooden beams overhead. The tapping came again, louder this time, followed by a slow, dragging sound. It was coming from outside. His heart pounded as he moved to the door, peeking through the small, dirt-streaked window. The fog had grown thicker, and through it, he saw movement. A figure was dragging itself between the gravestones, its body hunched and misshapen. It moved with a sickening, jerking motion, as if its limbs were bending in ways they shouldn't. Jack's grip on the door tightened. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. The figure stopped abruptly, its head snapping in his direction. Even through the fog, he could feel its eyes on him, though he couldn't make out a face. The figure began to move faster now, shambling toward the chapel. Jack slammed the door shut and locked it, his breathing rapid. He backed away, his flashlight flickering as the tapping resumed, this time on the outside of the door. It grew louder and more frantic, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. Jack stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Slowly, he approached the door again and looked through the window. The figure was gone. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The dragging sound returned, this time from above. His head shot up and his flashlight's beam landed on the ceiling. The wooden boards creaked and groaned as something heavy moved across them. Dust rained down, and the sound stopped directly above him. Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the chapel as a hole burst open in the ceiling. Jack stumbled back, barely catching a glimpse of the thing that dropped through. It landed on all fours, its limbs impossibly long, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. The creature's face, or what should have been its face, was a blank expanse of pale skin. It let out a sound, a mix between a snarl and a wet gasp, and began crawling toward him, its movements unnervingly fast. Jack bolted for the side door, yanking it open and sprinting into the fog. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to get away. The dragging sound followed him, louder and closer with every step. The fog seemed to thicken, suffocating him, and the gravestones blurred together in the gloom. He tripped over a root, falling hard onto the damp earth. Turning onto his back, he shone his flashlight behind him. The beam caught the creature mid-lunge, its mouth now split open to reveal rows of jagged black teeth. It let out a deafening screech, and the flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed him. Weeks later, a local groundskeeper found Jack's car abandoned by the cemetery gates. Inside was his wallet, phone, and an open road atlas with a red circle around the area. Search parties combed the cemetery and the surrounding woods, but found no trace of him, except for his flashlight lying on a gravestone engraved with the name Jack Connors. No one could explain how the date of death had been freshly carved, the same night Jack disappeared.
Story number 9.
It was nearing midnight when Clara found herself lost on an unfamiliar forest road. She had been heading home from a weekend retreat, her GPS rerouting her into what seemed like an endless maze of trees. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the road ahead cloaked in darkness. Just as her fuel gauge hit empty, her car sputtered to a stop. She groaned, banging the steering wheel in frustration. With no cell service, her only option was to set off on foot. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The road stretched on for miles, but up ahead, she spotted a faint light flickering through the trees. Hope surged in her chest as she followed it, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The light grew brighter, revealing a house, an old, sprawling Victorian mansion that seemed entirely out of place in the middle of nowhere. The front door was slightly ajar, a warm, golden light spilling onto the porch. Clara hesitated, but the bitter cold and her growing exhaustion pushed her forward. She knocked on the door, her voice trembling as she called out, "Hello? Is anyone home?" There was no response. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The house was eerily pristine, its hardwood floors gleaming and the furniture arranged as if expecting company. A grand chandelier hung above the foyer, its crystals casting rainbows on the walls. The warmth was inviting, but something felt off. "Hello?" she called again, her voice echoing. Still no answer. Clara moved further inside, drawn by the sound of faint music. It was coming from a room at the end of the hallway. She peeked in to find an old gramophone spinning a record, the haunting melody of a waltz filling the air. The room was empty, except for a single chair facing away from her, draped in a heavy black shawl. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. She tapped it against her palm, and when it came back on, the chair was empty. The shawl had fallen to the floor. Clara's breath hitched as the music slowed, the record beginning to skip. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. She grabbed the handle, twisting it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just need help." The chandelier above her began to sway, its crystals tinkling like wind chimes. The air grew colder, and the once warm light of the house dimmed, replaced by a sickly green glow. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements unnatural and deliberate. A whisper brushed past her ear, so close it felt like a breath. "You shouldn't be here." Clara spun around, shining her flashlight into the room. The beam caught a figure standing in the far corner, its back to her. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an odd angle. It didn't move, but Clara could feel its attention on her, heavy and oppressive. She stepped back, her shaking hand dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting erratic beams of light. The figure twitched, its limbs jerking as it began to turn toward her. Before she could see its face, the room plunged into darkness. Her screams echoed through the house as the sound of footsteps, quick and uneven, rushed toward her. The next morning, Clara's car was found abandoned on the side of the road, its doors locked and her keys still in the ignition. A local search party combed the forest but found no trace of her. Weeks later, a hiker reported hearing faint music deep in the woods. When authorities investigated, they stumbled upon the Victorian mansion, despite the area being marked as uninhabited for decades. Inside, they found no sign of Clara, only the gramophone spinning endlessly, playing a waltz that never seemed to end.
Story number 10.
Deep in the heart of an overgrown forest stood a decrepit, forgotten carnival ground. Its rusted rides and tattered tents were barely visible beneath decades of moss and vines. Local kids dared each other to visit, but no one ever stayed long. They spoke in hushed tones about the old Ferris wheel, the one that still turned sometimes, on windless nights when the air was too quiet. Leah didn't believe the stories. She prided herself on being fearless, and when her friends teased her for refusing to explore the carnival, she finally gave in. Armed with her phone and a flashlight, she ventured into the woods alone. The moon was full, casting silvery light on the worn path. It wasn't long before she spotted the carnival gates. They were rusted and bent, the peeling sign above them barely legible. Moonlit Fair. She pushed the gates open with a groan, stepping into the eerie stillness of the park. The rides were skeletal remains of their former selves. The carousel horses were missing eyes, their paint chipped and faded. The bumper cars were overturned, their wires coiled like dead snakes. Leah walked slowly, documenting everything for her friends, her flashlight flickering against the twisted shadows. When she reached the Ferris wheel, she froze. The stories were true. It was moving. Slowly, impossibly, its creaking gondolas swung in a rhythmic, ghostly cycle. There was no wind, and the rusted gears should have been long seized. Probably just gravity or something, she muttered to herself, swallowing her unease. But as she approached, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Someone was sitting in one of the gondolas. The figure was slumped forward, its head hanging at an unnatural angle. Leah called out, her voice shaky. "Hey, are you okay?" The gondola didn't stop, continuing its slow journey to the bottom. When it reached the ground level, Leah stepped closer. Her flashlight beam illuminated the figure, a clown, its painted face cracked and smeared, its eyes black pits. It snapped its head up to look at her. Leah screamed and stumbled back, dropping her phone. The clown's mouth split into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. It stood, moving jerkily as if its joints weren't connected properly, and stepped out of the gondola. She turned and ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she darted through the park. Behind her, she heard the heavy thud of footsteps. Too fast, too close. The sound was accompanied by laughter, shrill and distorted, echoing through the empty rides. She didn't dare look back, but the laughter grew louder, surrounding her, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The path twisted and turned, the trees closing in, and she realized with mounting terror that she was lost. Her flashlight flickered again and died, plunging her into darkness. The laughter stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. Leah crouched low, trying to steady her breathing, her heart hammering in her chest. A voice broke the stillness, low and sing-song. "Round and round, we all fall down." Leah bolted, her hands outstretched in the dark. She stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to her knees. She could see the carnival gates ahead, their warped frame glowing faintly in the moonlight. She was almost free. As she stood to run, she felt something cold and metallic close around her wrist. She looked down and screamed. A hand, painted white with streaks of red, was gripping her. She turned to see the clown, its face inches from hers. Its grin widened as it leaned closer, whispering, "Your turn to ride." The next morning, the locals found her phone just outside the carnival gates. On it was a single video, shaky footage of Leah running through the park, the Ferris wheel turning in the background. In the final frame, a gondola came into view. Inside sat a new figure, its face pale and slack, its body slumped like a forgotten doll. It was Leah,